Hey guys, I wanted to share something that happened to me right when I landed a new job and bought my first house. No one could have predicted that this house held secrets so disturbing, so beyond imagination, that they became the source of an obsession that nearly drove me to the brink of insanity. I won't waste any more of your time. Let me get straight into it. It all started right after I graduated. I had been living at home for a while, sending out resumes everywhere. Luckily, thanks to decent grades and a solid internship at a well-known firm, I started getting calls. I went on interviews all over the place and ended up with 3 job offers, way better than I expected. The catch? The 3 companies were in 3 different states, forming a sort of triangle far from my hometown. After talking it over with my parents, I chose the one that, while not the highest paying, seemed the most stable with the best path for a promotion. I packed my bags, moved to that state, and started renting. I worked there for a while, eventually got promoted, and my salary started looking pretty good. At that point, I decided I wanted to put down roots. The area was great, actually more developed than my hometown, and it was only about an hour's drive to my parents' place. I figured instead of throwing money away on rent, I'd invest in a mortgage. I finally found a place in a quiet residential neighborhood. It was an older house, but still in great shape, and the price was just right. Not too cheap to be suspicious, but affordable enough for my budget. I pulled the trigger and bought it. The house was a single-story ranch-style home with a small yard wrapping around it. There was space for a driveway in the front and a bit of extra land in the back if I ever wanted to build an extension. The lawn was covered in soft, lush grass. It was the dream. I remember thinking that no matter what happened with my job, I wanted to stay in this house forever. For a while, life was normal. I had my parents up to visit, and we did a little housewarming ceremony. According to our traditions, everything was peaceful. I had no idea what was coming. Then, at Miskay's Ashmen one night, I got home late from work. Like is, I come half-aids showered, and hit the sack around 11 p.m. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a woman's scream. It was incredibly loud and high-pitched, like it was tearing through my eardrums. As I sat up, heart pounding, trying to listen, I realized the sound was coming from the backyard. I sat there, frozen, for about 20 seconds before the screaming stopped. In that moment, I knew I wasn't hallucinating. I had to go see what it was. My mind was racing. Was someone breaking in? Was something happening behind my fence? Since it was a 1-story house, my bedroom window looked right out onto the back. I peeked through the blinds. Nothing. It was pitch black. I whispered to myself, "What the hell was that? Was I dreaming? There's nothing out there." Man, that sound gave me the chills. That night, even after I got the courage to open the back door and look around, I saw absolutely nothing. Just the empty lawn and the neighbor's wall. No shadows, no movement. The rest of the night passed in silence. A while later, I started dating Elena, and eventually, she moved in with me. At first, everything was fine, but then, I felt the bed shift, like someone was sitting up. I opened my eyes and saw Elena. She's beautiful, even when she's half asleep, but what I saw next made my skin crawl. She got out of bed very slowly, walked to the foot of the bed, turned right, and shuffled out of the room. Her movements were stiff, like a zombie, as if she were being controlled by some invisible force. I thought, where is she going at this hour? I tried calling her name, but she didn't answer. At first, I thought she was just going for a midnight snack. She'd mentioned being hungry before bed but didn't want the calories. But then I heard her unlatching the back door. I jumped out of bed and ran after her. When I got to the kitchen, I saw her opening the door, stepping out into the night like she was heading somewhere specific. I grabbed her arm and pulled her back. Realizing her eyes were shut tight, she was sleepwalking. "Elena, what are you doing? Where are you going?" I asked, shaking her gently. She blinked, looking confused. Huh? What's going on? Why are you out here? I don't know what happened. I led her back to the bedroom. Once we sat down, she told me something that turned my blood cold. She said she saw someone. She couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, standing right outside the window, waving at her, beckoning her to come out. She was in that half-awake, half-dream state and thought it was real. I told her it was just a nightmare and stayed up to watch over her while she fell back asleep. Once she was out, my curiosity and fear got the better of me. I thought maybe there was a prowler or a peeping Tom. I grabbed a heavy wooden stick I kept by the door and stepped outside. Even though I'd lived there for nearly a year, I rarely went to the very back of the property. I usually hired someone to mow the lawn, so I never had a reason to poke around. I did a lap around the house. Everything seemed normal. But as I walked back toward the bedroom wall, I realized the wall was actually quite thin, and the window was low. If someone stood right there, they could see everything Elena and I were doing inside. I decided to head back in and deal with it in the morning. But in the dark, and because I wasn't familiar with the ground back there, as I turned to lean my stick against the corner of the wall, my leg suddenly dropped into a hole. It felt like an invisible hand had reached up and snatched me. I let out a yelp as my leg sank into a pipe. It was deep. My foot was dangling, and I couldn't feel the bottom. I screamed for help, and Elena came running out, terrified. When she finally helped me pull my leg out, I was a mess. My shin and thigh were gouged and bleeding badly. There was some nasty grime on my lower leg. I rinsed it off quickly and had Elena drive me to the ER. The doctor had to give me stitches and a tetanus shot, along with some heavy-duty painkillers. By the time we got home, the wound was burning and throbbing so much I couldn't even think about sleep. Elena asked, "How did you even fall? Weren't you looking where you were going?" "I don't know," I groaned. "I never even knew there was a pipe back there. It was just so slick." I slipped right in. At least, the equipment is still intact. Doctor says everything still works fine down there. I was joking to keep her from worrying. But deep down, something felt wrong. Very wrong. I had never noticed that pipe, and it didn't have a cover. Not when I bought the house. Not when the mowers were there. It was just there. The next morning, I called in sick. Around noon, I hobbled out to the backyard to get a better look at what I was dealing with. It looked like a standard drainage pipe, about a foot wide and maybe a foot and a half deep. It was probably intended for a future kitchen renovation or an outdoor sink. I decided I'd measure it and have a local metal shop fabricate a heavy steel cover for it. As I finished measuring and turned to go back inside, a voice whispered directly into my ear, crystal clear, "Help me." I spun around so fast I almost tore my stitches. There was no one there. My heart was thumping against my ribs. For some reason, I found myself looking back down into that pipe, and I swear to you, I saw a pair of tiny, lidless eyes staring straight back up at me from the darkness. I scrambled back, terrified. After I caught my breath, I tried to convince myself it was just a stray cat or my mind playing tricks because of the painkillers. I looked again, but the eyes were gone. I was shaking. But I didn't tell Elena. I didn't want to sound crazy. A few days later, once I could walk a bit better, I went to a nearby metal shop. The owner, a guy I'd done business with before, told me my measurements might be off and offered to send one of his guys over to get a precise template. The worker followed me home on his bike. I pointed him toward the backyard. "It's right back there. Man, have at it. I'm gonna go sit down for a minute. My leg is killing me." I went inside to grab him a glass of water, but before I could even get to the kitchen, a blood-curdling scream echoed from the yard. I rushed out as fast as I could. The worker was backed up against the fence, his face as white as a sheet, trembling. "What happened?" I shouted. He could barely speak. He just pointed at the pipe and stammered, There's someone in there. Someone was looking at me from inside that pipe." That was the confirmation I needed. I wasn't crazy. I called the previous owner immediately, trying to stay calm. I asked him if anything at all, had happened in this house. He swore on his life that he'd lived there for 6 years and never had a single issue. He sounded sincere, which only made things more confusing. About a week later, the cover was supposed to be ready. I'd gone back to work, so I stopped by the metal shop on my way home to pay. But the owner looked at me with a weird expression. He told me the job was delayed because the worker I'd met had fallen into that same pipe and was too spooked to come back to my house. He wouldn't even take my money yet. I was stunned. How does a professional metal worker just fall into a hole he was literally there to measure? When I pulled into my driveway that evening, I noticed Elena's car was already there. She usually worked late, so I felt a pang of worry. I walked inside and the house was a disaster. Furniture was shifted. The back door was wide open. I ran to the backyard and froze. Elena was lying on the grass, her face pressed against the dirt, her entire right arm shoved deep into that drainage pipe. "Elena, what the hell are you doing?" I screamed so loud she jolted awake, shrieking. When she pulled her arm out, it was covered up to the shoulder in a thick, oily black sludge. It was disgusting, and it didn't make sense when I fell in. The pipe was mostly dry. I dragged her inside and started scrubbing the grime off her. She was sobbing, hysterical. "I was napping," she choked out. "I dreamed you came home and sat next to me. But then someone grabbed your hand and dragged you outside. They pulled you toward the pipe and your body it started stretching, like you were being squeezed through a straw into that hole. I ran out to pull you back, and then I must have blacked out. I'd had enough. I drove her back to her parents' house that night and told her to stay there until I figured this out. I went back home alone, determined to end this. Since the metal shop flaked, I took a heavy solid oak table the previous owner had left behind and flipped it upside down over the pipe. It weighed at least 25 pounds. That night, the nightmares were unbearable. I dreamed of blood, raw meat, and black slime bubbling out of the pipe. I saw clumps of hair and fingernails being vomited onto my lawn. I woke up drenched in sweat and ran to the window. The heavy oak table had been shoved 5 feet away. The pipe was wide open. Desperate, I called a commercial plumber the next morning. I told him the drain was backed up and I needed it snaked. The guy arrived, looked at the pipe, and poured some water down. "It's not clogged, pal. You're wasting your money." I lied. I told him it flooded every time it rained and I wanted a deep clean. He shrugged, pulled out a power snake, a long, motorized steel cable, and fed it deep into the pipe. When he reversed the motor and pulled the cable back up, a smell hit us that I can only describe as rotting death and fermented trash. I actually had to run inside to keep from puking. When I came back out, the plumber was standing perfectly still, staring into a black trash bag where he'd deposited the clog. "Is something wrong?" I asked. I don't know," he whispered. "I thought I saw. It looked like a piece of a person." My heart stopped. I looked into the bag and saw chunks of grayish-black, mushy organic matter. It looked like meat that had been left in a gutter for a month. I paid him double just to get him to leave and take that bag with him. But the horror wasn't over. Around midnight, I was startled by a loud thud against my front door. I grabbed a flashlight and ran out. Someone had thrown a heavy black trash bag at my house. It had burst on impact, splattering that foul, rotting sludge all over my porch. It was the same bag the plumber had taken. I didn't know if he'd done it or if something else had brought it back. I spent the rest of the night hosing down the porch, crying from pure frustration and fear. At 8 a.m., I was woken up by sirens, not in the distance, right outside. I looked out the back and saw 4 or 5 police officers climbing over my back fence. One of them called out my name. "Can we come in? We have an emergency situation and need to inspect your yard." I let them in. my head spinning. They asked if they could dig up the area around the pipe. "Look, we're going to be honest with you," one detective said. "The woman who lives in the house behind yours, we have reason to believe she performed an illegal late-term abortion and disposed of the remains in the drainage system. We need to check your grease trap." I watched, numb, as they spent the morning digging. I broke down in tears when they finally pulled it out. The remains of a newborn baby, no bigger than a kitten, which had been washed through the shared drainage lines and got stuck in the trap directly under my yard. They explained that the neighbor's husband had forced her to do it, then fled. The night I heard that soul-shredding scream, that was the night she had done it. The timeline matched perfectly with when my haunting began. The baby had drifted through the pipes and lodged itself right under my bedroom window. The plumber had been the one to call it in. When he got home and actually looked at what he'd pulled out of the pipe, he saw a tiny hand. He'd freaked out, thrown the bag back at my house in a moment of sheer panic/denial, and then finally called 911 when his conscience got the better of him. After the police left and the neighbor was arrested, I hired a crew to rip out the pipe entirely and fill the hole with solid concrete. But the trauma hasn't left us. Mateo and Elena still share the same recurring dream. We see a small child standing at the foot of our bed, asking if he can stay. When we don't answer, he just runs around the room, playing in the shadows. Sometimes, Elena dreams of a dark shape trying to crawl back into her womb. We've decided we aren't having children. We're too afraid of who, or what, might decide to be born into our family. Story number 2. This story took place nearly 30 years ago, back when I was just 15 or 16. My family lived in a pocket of rural Nagano so impoverished that my parents couldn't afford to keep me. When I was 4, they sent me to Tokyo to be raised by my aunt so I'd have a shot at a real education. She never had children of her own, so she loved me like a son. And while life in the capital was comfortable, a piece of my heart was always tethered to the countryside. I lived in a constant state of homesickness. One afternoon, I came home from school to find my aunt looking pale. She had news from my mother. My father was in critical condition. His chances were 50-50 at best. He had developed bile duct cancer, a grim consequence of a lifelong habit of eating raw beef liver, a delicacy from his youth. Early the next morning, I threw a few things into a bag and caught a bus out of Tokyo, bracing for the 375-mile journey back to my roots. In those days, there was no internet, no GPS, and no cell phones. You navigated by maps and the kindness of strangers. By the time I reached the central station in Nagano, it was 8 p.m. The locals pointed me toward an isolated, weathered bus stop on the outskirts of town to wait for the local line that headed toward my home district. "You'll have to try your luck, kid," they told me. "No telling if the last bus has passed. If it has, you're stuck here until sunrise." I sat in the heavy silence of the dark. Eventually, a bus pulled up, and I scrambled on. But a few minutes into the ride, the conductor told me I'd boarded the wrong line. They let me off on the shoulder of a deserted road without charging me. I hopped down, intending to walk back to the original stop. But when I turned around, my blood ran cold. Even though I'd only been driving for a few minutes, the lights of the station and the bus stop were gone. Not just dimmed, completely erased. The world had been swallowed by a darkness so thick it felt physical. Just as despair began to set in, a pair of headlights cut through the gloom. An ancient, battered bus rumbled toward me. In the front window, a white sign with faded blue lettering displayed the name of my home district. I waved my arms like a castaway spotting a ship. I climbed aboard and glanced at my watch. It was exactly 10:26 p.m. the moment I stepped inside. The nauseating stench of scorched engine oil hit me, making my stomach churn. The interior was deathly silent. I paid the conductor and took a seat in the middle, on the right side. As the bus lurched forward, the scenery outside began to change into something unrecognizable. The paved road vanished, replaced by a narrow, dusty trail that hugged the base of a mountain. The driver was flooring it. The bus rattled violently as it sped through the night, never slowing for a single stop. No one got on, and no one got off. Exhausted, I leaned my head against the vibrating glass, trying to drift off. Suddenly, the driver slammed on the brakes so hard I nearly flew out of my seat. The driver, a man in his 30s, scrambled out the door and ran toward the embankment on the left. The other passengers and I peered through the windows. There, in the middle of a desolate clearing, was a small hokora, a miniature roadside shrine that had been smashed to pieces. The driver was frantically trying to piece the stones back together, his fingers clawing at the dirt, trying to force the shrine upright. Suddenly, the conductor leaned his head out the window and screamed, "Hurry up! Move it! We're going to be late!" The driver, trembling with visible terror, abandoned the shrine and sprinted back to the bus. He slammed it into gear and took off like he was being hunted by a demon. A few minutes later, the driver called back to the conductor to re-verify everyone's tickets. I fumbled in my pocket and handed mine over. The conductor leaned in, squinting at the slip of paper and then at my face. His expression shifted from cold indifference to a jagged snarl. "You can't go any further," he growled. "Get off! Now!" I stammered, asking if I owed more money or if I'd made a mistake. But they didn't want to hear it. Both the driver and the conductor began shouting, barking at me to get off as if I were a stray animal. They practically threw me onto the dark shoulder of the road. I stood there, dazed, watching the bus pull away, but after it had traveled only a few yards, the image of the bus began to flicker. It grew translucent, then vanished into thin air, leaving no taillights, no engine noise, nothing but a ringing silence. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was hallucinating from exhaustion. I started walking into the void, and 15 minutes later, I heard an engine again. Another bus was approaching. When it pulled up, I gasped. It was the same bus, the same blue lettering, the same smell, despite the terror gnawing at my gut. The need to see my father outweighed my fear. I flagged it down again. As I stepped in, the conductor didn't even look at me. "Flat rate, just sit down," he muttered. But history repeated itself. Moments later, the conductor caught sight of me and his eyes went wide with rage. "You again? I told you, you aren't allowed on this ride. Get the hell off!" He shoved me out the door. This time, I didn't move. I watched with hawk-like focus. The bus rolled forward, and just like before, it didn't drive away. It simply dissolved into the night. I was spiraling into a full-blown panic. I kept walking, my footsteps heavy on the dirt path. And then, for the third time, those twin beams of light cut through the trees. The same bus groaned as it slowed to a crawl beside me. But this time, I didn't even get a chance to set foot on the step. The conductor was standing right in the doorway. His face wasn't just angry anymore. It was twisted, distorted by a primal, desperate rage. He loomed over me, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "If you dare try to board this bus one more time, I'm taking you with us. Do you want to die that badly? Stay off, or you're never going back." I collapsed onto the gravel, my legs giving out. I watched as the bus pulled away in Sayano. Once again, bled into the shadows until it was gone. I sat there in the dirt, sobbing, lost in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. A few minutes later, a different sound reached my ears. A high-pitched, mechanical hum. A single headlight appeared, and an old man on an ancient, red Honda Cub scooter puttered toward me. He skidded to a stop, his eyes wide and frantic. "Kid," he shouted, "tell me you didn't get on that bus! Are you trying to get yourself killed?" I couldn't even speak. I just lunged for him, grabbing his arm like a lifeline. He told me to hop on the back, and he throttled the little engine, taking off down the mountain road. As we rounded a sharp, treacherous bend. The air suddenly changed. The smell of scorched oil was gone, replaced by the suffocating, metallic stench of fresh blood and gasoline. Then I saw it. The scene was a slaughterhouse. The bus, the exact same bus, was flipped on its side, the frame twisted like a discarded soda can. Shards of glass carpeted the road, reflecting the moonlight like jagged diamonds. Bodies were scattered across the asphalt in unnatural positions. As we rode slowly past, I looked into the shattered windshield. There was the driver, slumped over the steering wheel, his life gone. The conductor had been thrown through the glass. His body was mangled beyond recognition. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. We kept riding until Goes. Further down the road, the darkness gave way to a warm, golden glow. I heard the rhythmic beat of taiko drums and the bright, fluttering notes of a flute. It looked like a village festival was in full swing. Lanterns were strung everywhere, and crowds of people were walking between stalls, selling steaming food. The old man pulled over at the edge of the clearing and turned to me, his expression deadly serious. "Listen to me very carefully," he whispered. "Do not listen to that music. Do not buy any food. And whatever you do, do not speak to a single person here. Sit right here and don't move until the sun comes up." Before I could ask why, he kicked the scooter into gear and vanished into the night. I huddled on the ground, squeezed my eyes shut, and pressed my palms against my ears, praying for the morning. Just seconds after the sound of his engine faded, the music stopped, the chatter died. I opened my eyes, and the world was empty. No lanterns, no stalls, no people. Just a cold, barren field. I sat there, shivering in the silence, until the first gray light of dawn broke over the mountains at 6 a.m. Shaky and exhausted, I noticed a small temple about 100 yards away. I stumbled toward it, desperate for some sign of life. In the temple courtyard, my heart nearly stopped. There it was, the red Honda Cub. But it wasn't the functional machine from the night before. It was a skeleton of rust. The tires were shredded and flat, and a thick layer of dust and cobwebs covered the seat as if it hadn't been touched in decades. An old man working on the temple grounds saw me and came over. Through tears, I told him everything: the bus, the crash, the shrine, and the man on the scooter. He listened in grim silence, then led me to a stone memorial tucked away behind the main hall. "The man you saw," the worker said quietly, "was the caretaker of this temple. Over 20 years ago, he was killed in a horrific bus accident at that very bend in the road. The driver was high on stimulants, speeding to make up time. He hit a hokora, a roadside shrine, and the bus flipped." He sighed, looking at the rusted bike. "The souls of that driver and conductor are trapped in a loop. Every night of the full moon, they're forced to relive that final journey as penance. They try to fix the shrine they knocked over, but they can never do it. They didn't kick you off because they were mean, son. They knew you were still among the living. They were saving you. And the old caretaker, well, he's been watching over travelers on that road since the day he passed. The monks performed a purification ritual for me and helped me catch a legitimate bus home. But the tragedy didn't end there. When I finally walked through my front door, I was met with the sound of mourning. My father had passed away in the early hours of that morning. I often think back to that night, to the ghosts who screamed at me to get off. I realized then that if they hadn't delayed me, if I had stayed on that first bus, I wouldn't have just missed saying goodbye to my father. I would have joined those lost souls on a journey that never ends. To this day, whenever I see a bus on a dark country road, I check the clock. And I never, ever look for a sign with blue lettering